right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today. We are going to talk about budgeting and security as we head into Q4. Lots of folks enter budget season and have to justify either what they have, what they need, and how we talk about it, I think deeply impacts our success. Just housekeeping stuff, we will share the slides and a recording afterwards. If you are watching this and have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Our emails are at the bottom and you can chat with us directly. So quick intro, my name is Vidya Murthy. I serve as COO here at MedCrypt. I've been in the device security space for a bit more than 10 years at this point, and in security prior to this at Becton Dickinson. Axel?
Yes, thanks, Vidya. So Axel Worth, I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at MedCrypt. Actually spent my entire career, first job out of college until now, in the medical device industry, the last 15 years of which with a focus on cybersecurity.
Awesome. Cool. So we'll get started. And if you have any questions, there's also a Q&A box that you can click and go from there. Eek, too far. All right. So why is security a strategic imperative, right? I think a lot of times security is perceived as a cost center. And as a result, it doesn't directly tie to what people see as business value. And that makes it really hard for folks to sometimes come up with understanding why security should be invested in. And so what I think there's four kind of major things that we would think about, right? You have your most obvious product security risk, the fact that if the device does not clinically operate, you end up in a difficult position. And these are this is from the guidance, right? This is what the guidance is called when it comes to post-market vigilance. And then you have the chance of a regulator saying, hey, your device isn't doing what it's supposed to do. We need you to do a recall. And just relatively recently, we have seen recalls due to security happening. And we've even seen the DOJ have some initiatives related to security. So I think the overall regulatory landscape is changing a little bit and evolving. The next area of focus, I think, is on those things that are not part of your core business. We all use third parties for different capabilities, and managing that is a challenge in and of itself, especially when we think about how it impacts device security. And then the last area we'll focus on has a lot to do with legacy devices, which tends to be, while something we'd rather not focus on, still a very big part of the problem and what folks have to deal with on a daily basis when it comes to actual devices in the field. So yeah, our session will cover those four areas. And if there's any questions as you come up, again, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat. So why does this matter? As folks who likely care about security, you already know this and I'm preaching to the choir, but just so we're all clear, right? The financial impact is growing more than ever. The DOJ's recent, I think it was $6 million. No, not 6 million. Axel, do you remember how big it was?
I do not, sorry.
It was a huge fine that got put on a device manufacturer for the first time we saw it related to security. And it was an interesting evolution of how the DOJ is changing how they're looking at security and its impact on operations. But we see that more than just the FDA is starting to care about this. We also see consumers, when it comes to hospitals or health systems that are making decisions based on security. And I think there was a report that recently came out that said close to 30% of procurement choices were swayed because of security choices alone, which is, I think, telling of how the entire community is maturing their knowledge of security. We have a lot of awareness now around reputational damage. There is anecdotally a large health system that is putting a device manufacturer on the don't buy list because of security concerns. So we know that how device manufacturers approach security can directly impact kind of their perception in the market. And the last one is patient safety, right? Most obviously, we all want our devices to do what they're supposed to do without offering any impact on patient care. But we are hearing of anecdotes where devices are not operating as intended. In particular, there's one kind of in the diabetes space right now that's making a lot of headlines. It's been more obviously discussed how patient impacts are coming from security as a root cause. And I think that positions security differently in an organization. I think a lot of times security was part of what was perceived as kind of big IT, and it wanted to follow the same tooling and the same approach as a lot of kind of the enterprise concerns. And it's really realizing that it's not so obviously an IT problem anymore, and that the development of the device and kind of the operation and the post-market vigilance are separate needs than what kind of a corporate structure can traditionally offer when it comes to managing device security posture. Actually, you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, and quick tangent, I looked up the DOJ situation, so you were close, but not high enough. It was 9.8 million, just happened last July, and it was a fine imposed because of violations of the False Claims Act, but with regards to a cybersecurity situation. So cybersecurity claims were actually interpreted as incorrect cybersecurity claims as a violation of the False Claims Act, resulting not in a HIPAA fine, not in an FDA situation, but in a DOJ situation. So clearly, as Vidya was saying, the nature of risk to the business continues to expand. So back to the slide here. This is about integrating security into your product development lifecycle. Right? Certainly, everybody has their quality systems in place. No matter what device you design, you need a quality system that assures the safety and effectiveness of your device, and that you can demonstrate safety and effectiveness. And that, in this day and age, also includes cybersecurity. ISO 14971 is certainly a good baseline to build your risk management framework for your product development, and that will guide you then along your entire development lifecycle, including how you implement security early on in the design phase during your architecture, building your threat models, implement the first steps of your secure by design approach, but then all the way through development and implementation following secure coding practices, performing your module level testing at the various integration stages using both static and dynamic analysis, either with human support or using tools, depends on your complexity. And then all the way to verification and validation, where cybersecurity is part of the testing, including very specific asked by the FDA, including penetration testing, ideally conducted by an independent entity. And I think the short definition is that you want your pen tester to not have an economic interest in the outcome of the test. So if you have your own engineers that have a bonus tied to the release of a product to the pen testing, that would be a conflict of interest. And many companies, for exactly that purpose, go to the outside, hire an external entity to perform the pen testing. Or I've seen larger companies that have the means to create independent departments, but they are from a organizational, but also from a business and incentive perspective, firewalled off from the product groups to assure independence. And then, of course, other than pen testing, there are plenty of tool-based technologies you can use, including vulnerability scanning, SBOM-based vulnerability management, fuzz testing, you name it. And then, of course, it all goes into the post-market, where you then implement your post-market surveillance and vulnerability management. Make sure that you validate and deploy patches in a timely manner, and potentially respond to incidents, which by itself is a fairly complex topic. Is the incident, for example, in a cloud-hosted environment that offers a service to your customers? That's a different story than an incident at a fielded device that is operated by your customers, which is different than an incident in your manufacturing environment, which is different than an incident that impacts your remote service and support infrastructure. So again, there's a lot of weight behind that simple word here. Next slide, please. Okay. And I mean, this is, one way you can look at it, and this is a more technical and detailed breakdown. And this type of V model obviously has been around and has been used as an explainer for many software topics, including cybersecurity, but not limited to cybersecurity. This being about cybersecurity, basically explaining that, yeah, you start high level with your requirements, and then drive it down through your design and architecture, module design, and then the coding and integration. And then on the way out, so to speak, in the right branch here, um, then you engage in your various testing activities, right? And the important thing here is that you conduct the right activities at the right time. There are certain activities that offer benefits and lend itself to being conducted early on at the module level, at the integration level. Then there are other techniques that are more appropriate later on, for example, pen testing, and then certainly anything that involves clinical trials or other field testing, which of course does need to include the collection of cybersecurity data as well. And then, of course, across the entire process here, down the left branch, up the right branch, make sure that everything is documented and that you have traceability from your requirements, your identified risks, your implemented risk controls, then all the way to your testing that then demonstrates that your controls were implemented correctly, work as intended, and that your requirements are sufficient and complete from a cybersecurity perspective. Next slide, please.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, so from a documentation perspective, we help customers with getting security into their QMS from a documentation. And I think there's something like 23 unique documents that have to make reference to this. So one of the challenges we often see, right, is making sure things are consistently discussed across parts of the QMS and how they work, and making sure that if a change is made to a process, right, it gets reflected back across the board. It becomes hard to do because it's so pervasively included across parts of the QMS. So to talk a little bit about how the FDA looks at it, right? So I think one of the things that we consistently see is a little bit of variability in how the FDA enforces their view of security. Now, in the last, I don't know, 8 months, maybe, I would say this has changed a little bit, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of these three areas in particular. So eSTAR as the main mechanism for submitting submission to the FDA has allowed for consistency in terms of the fields that are being looked for and making sure that that data is provided by a device maker. And that has really, I think, upped the FDA's ability to draw a baseline that is consistently enforced. I think when it used to rely a little bit more on the reviewer's assessment, you've removed a little bit of that, and now everybody has to first meet a first threshold of certain security being documented and discussed in a submission. The next one around software bill of materials, we know that the FDA is working on building their own solution for being able to ingest the SBOMs that are being provided by device makers, so they can then also see, hey, all known KEVs are identified and discussed, or vulnerabilities are available when the next, I don't know, log4j comes out, making sure that they can quickly determine who is impacted as well. And changing how that is consumed, not just by the regulator, but also consumers of devices, right? So I think we see a lot of health systems that are increasingly asking for SBOMs and not just putting them in their file cabinet. They're in fact asking for ongoing demonstration of some sort of review or vulnerabilities being addressed or the like. And the last one is directly that, right? What do we do if something does happen and there is a vulnerability on a device? How do device makers address these findings? How do they ensure that whatever criteria are being used to determine if they should make a change are consistent and appropriate for the needs of device makers? And I think, and Axel, I'm curious if you would feel similarly, but most frequently, vulnerability management tends to be the thing most widely discussed by consumers of device makers, whether it's the regulator or the health system. And a lot of it has to do with ongoing maintenance and ensuring that that post-market vigilance is really up to par. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen change, and this is really more recently over the past year or so is that increasingly the buyers of medical devices, hospitals, and other healthcare organizations put a focus on cybersecurity. Right? We now see cybersecurity terms, both technical and procedural, show up in contracts. We now see hospitals asking for specific response timing and communication to be used with regards to vulnerabilities discovered in the devices they operate. Now, at the same time, we also know that addressing vulnerabilities in devices deployed in hospitals, be it, for example, by deploying a patch, lags significantly. Hospitals are not that good at deploying patches, and yes, there are certainly challenges in doing it with ongoing clinical care delivery and patient services and whatnot. But at the same time, again, what we've seen over the last year is that does not stop hospitals to put more pressure on their vendors to ask for better security and better security response and communication.
Um, and so I think that that nicely marries into this area where we think about like what is outside of the device maker's typical focus, right? And the extended enterprise. So those who are charged with building software know that we don't write everything from scratch anymore, right? That's just not how software is written. And the extensive use of not just third-party software, but open source is kind of a unique thing to be considered in addition to contract manufacturing. So for those who use contract manufacturers, there's a lot of challenges that come with that, right? You don't have control of their network. You don't necessarily understand what they do on a daily basis and how they work to build your software the way it would be if you were writing it yourself. And so one of the things you really needs to be considered is how that relationship is set up and how you have confidence in what they've developed for you and what tools they're using and whether they know to check for KEVs or other things that shouldn't be part of your device. End of life, end of service is currently getting a lot of noise. I think that's a big one when using contract manufacturer. You may not necessarily know if they're choosing tech stacks that are going to put you in a difficult position for end of life. And making sure you have that level of detailed contractually covered as well can become really important because sometimes we see contract manufacturers who help you for the 3-6 months to get your device going, and then they kind of disappear, and it becomes the device maker's challenge to then figure out, okay, what was used, how was this built, and how do we maintain it going forward. And I think that the second half of that coin is making sure that third-party software is captured, right? And this isn't just kind of your high level, let me tell you the OS. You really need to have as many components as possible included in there so that you're able to have a robust view on what is in your device. And as you build out that third party, I think there's also a separate challenge when you use open source tooling, making sure you understand licensing challenges or dependencies that are in there because that can change how devices are impacted, right? What type of license you have can really change whether a vulnerability impacts a piece of software. Actually, I don't know if you'd add anything to this one.
No, I mean the large umbrella here is supply chain management, right? And that is certainly a challenge, and that's certainly something that every medical device manufacturer needs to get control over because that determines really your ability to manage cybersecurity across the entire life cycle, right? From your early development stages where you start integrating third-party components all the way to your post-market management and including end of life and end of support decisions, right? Your supply chain may in part determine what your decision is on ending support for a particular device. So having a good relationship and good visibility into your software supply chain is quite important.
You want to start with legacy devices?
Sure. I mean, so legacy devices is certainly, as the title says, the elephant in the room, right? It's a big thing that everybody is scared of. Doesn't matter whether you're a health system or manufacturer or regulator in that sense. The definition of legacy may vary a little bit depending on where you're coming from. So many times I talk to manufacturers, and their view of legacy is any device that was developed before the manufacturer had certain software and or cybersecurity processes in place. A regulator may look at legacy as something that was market released prior to certain regulatory requirements or certain standards being required through regulation. Whereas the operator, the hospital, typically looks at legacy as a device that is no longer being supported anymore. So again, legacy is a common term. It's a prompt for everybody, but different entities may use the term differently depending on the context and where they're coming from. However, the approach on getting a handle of today's legacy problem, minimizing the impact and the risk, and reducing the future legacy burden, I think is very similar across all stakeholders. Like risk-based prioritization. Understand the devices you have in the market, or if you're a hospital, you have on your network. Understand which devices have the highest risk due to their legacy status, and start addressing those devices through replacement, updates to a newer version, and so forth. Look at impact on revenue, right? Certain devices generate more revenue than others. So for a manufacturer, is it worthwhile, for example, to invest the money into porting a given device onto a new operating system that is not yet end of life, right? Or as a hospital, is replacing a device against the newer version financially justifiable? Those are revenue-driven decisions and prioritizations. Certainly from a regulatory perspective, right? FDA has made clear that devices already in the market need to be monitored from a cybersecurity perspective, from a post-market perspective, but don't need to be updated. However, if you apply for a new 510K or PMA for a device or a modification or an update, then FDA actually may ask for cybersecurity documentation and make sure that you have your due diligence. Over in Europe, the situation is a little more complicated, and the expectation that existing devices in the market are brought up to state of the art is a little higher than here in the US, actually. It's clearly spelled out in regulation. The interpretation is still a little bit fuzzy. I think we have to see a couple of cases to see how that actually is going to be interpreted and what that means for, again, legacy devices in the market over in Europe or countries that have a similar regulatory approach as it's done in Europe. Yeah, and then prioritize based on clinical impact. What if something would happen to the device? Is the impact on patient safety? What if something happens to the device? Is the impact on care delivery? But if we look at anecdotal evidence and statistical analysis of cybersecurity events in hospitals, right? We don't have that smoking gun, that particular one device that got hacked into and the patient was harmed. However, we have plenty of evidence of broader impact because of a broader attack. We know that mortality rate goes up while a hospital is undergoing a ransomware or cyber attack. We know that other hospitals in the region are impacted and their mortality rate goes up because they have to take on a higher patient load. We know that mortality rate continues at a slightly but statistically relevant higher level even after the security incident is resolved, even after a year or two, because of additional security measures that may impact access to care, access to data, access to devices by seconds or a few minutes, but nevertheless has measurable outcome. And then we've had two cases so far, one in the UK, in London, the other one here in the US, in Alabama, where directly the death of a patient was tied to a cyber attack and the resulting communication delays and breakdowns between different parts of the organization, or in the case in the UK, between healthcare providers and a pathology service provider, right? So those two cases have been directly tied to the death of a patient. But again, we have not seen any of those bad guy hacks into one device with the intent to harm a specific patient, right? We have not seen that, but we have plenty of evidence of, again, broader attacks having broader impact, including impact on mortality rates.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add is the FDA has clearly said they don't like probabilistic models, right? They say we don't want to look at the chance that something could be exploited. We just want to look at the fact that it could be exploited. And I think it's exactly for that reason, Axel. It may not always be a one-to-one relationship, and it could be something broader that could impact multiple devices. Um,
Indeed.
so how can we position security as something that needs help, right? I think there's four major areas that if discussed kind of with metrics behind them, you're able to see some support from the board or whomever it is that you're having these conversations with to try to get more support for security budgeting. One is this notion of exposure, right? Understanding that what your footprint is that's out there, what it's projected to be if devices go out as they are expected to, and really understanding what the security posture of those devices and their exploitability and everything that comes with that actually are. Not taking into effect, again, this probabilistic thing that the FDA doesn't like. And that can very clearly help tell the story of what could go wrong for those devices. Time to mitigate. So as alluded to before, right, there's been a lot of conversation around vulnerability management and post-market vigilance from the regulator, from consumers, all across kind of the whole industry. So how folks work on mitigating findings is kind of the second half of that, right? Great, we tell you that you have a vulnerability in your device. What do you then do with that knowledge, and how do you action it in a way that is useful for the device security posture? I think one of the challenges I see when folks try to implement metrics for security is that they say, gosh, this doesn't tell a good story at all. And I think that that's the challenge for a lot of security, right? But just starting to measure it and then over time saying, here's how we're going to mature it and here's how we're going to progress has resonated really well with leadership to really kind of say, okay, we know we might not be at the best spot right now, but because it takes us, I don't know, 90 days to patch something, maybe there's something we can think about changing in how we process this or how the QMS works or something else. The next one, audit deficiencies, and most likely there's some internal audit group that's hopefully looking at security. This could be part of what helps with telling the story around security narratives. I also have found, and increasingly so, health systems are doing their own pen testing on devices. Using kind of the output from what your customers may be giving you could be a helpful metric. Your sales folks may be able to help inform that and say, hey, I'm spending 40% of my time having security conversations. We need to eliminate that because it's slowing things down by 6 months. That's a really good anecdote to kind of try to work through developing as you go with budget requests. And then the last one, I think that understanding and translating security into a financial impact is huge. Super hard to do, absolutely, but there's a lot of tooling out there that can help tie what dollar amount could be impacted by some security challenges. Axel, is there anything you've seen kind of in the market with folks using metrics?
Uh, Not necessarily, but to your point, right? FDA is asking for that as well, right? We touched on that on an earlier slide, that things like the time from vulnerability discovery to patch availability or patch availability to deployment, I think should be measured, and it should be used as a metric for your business so that your business's performance with regards to security improves over time. So don't be shy to assess the security performance across your products of the different product groups. Make sure that the results are meaningful. Make sure that you identify why certain groups, for example, perform lower than others, and how that can be mitigated with the overall goal to continue to improve your organization. Identify the right metric, measure the metric, and then implement a corrective action.
So I think that the key takeaways we want to make sure folks get as they're heading into budget season, right, is really ensuring that this is a business imperative. Oh, there's a question on metrics. In terms of tracking metrics, do you track things differently depending on the severity of a vulnerability? For example, having a faster response for more severe vulnerabilities. Actually, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I think you should, right? And I think FDA certainly differentiates between higher and lower risk vulnerabilities and as they call it, controlled and uncontrolled risks, and provides then guidance on the expected response time. And I think you want to measure how you perform relative to FDA guidance as an absolute reference point, but also over time, how are you improving relative to various risk category? Another interesting metric could also be the number of vulnerabilities you discover in your products in the various categories, and it doesn't have to be crazy granular, like low, medium, high, may be sufficient. But clearly, as you look at to improve your organization's capability, to improve your designs, your development tools and practices, look at how the nature and the severity of vulnerability changes over time, rather than just do an absolute count of just the raw number of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I would say the FDA prescribed metrics are maybe the baseline, right? I don't know that they necessarily get you enough to really get corporate kind of buy-in to see it as a business imperative. What about differences between vulnerabilities in third-party software versus vulnerabilities in parts of your own device's software? Should they be handled differently?
Um, so I think they should go through the same process and should be tracked in the same tools. However, I think the biggest differentiator is that it is more likely that a third-party software vulnerability is known to the public, and it's less likely, not impossible, but less likely that a device-specific vulnerability that results from your own code is known to the public, right? Yes, there are security researchers that have bought certain medical devices on eBay and have identified design weaknesses. But I think, again, the third-party vulnerabilities are the bigger problem because they are typically known to the public. And especially if those are vulnerabilities in commercial software, think about your operating system, because all of a sudden you're exposed to malware and attacks that were produced just because of the prevalence of a given operating system. Like Windows is a classic example. And so if you build your device on Windows, you know you have a big problem, not because somebody may decide to attack your device in the future, but because there are millions and millions of Windows viruses out there that people wrote in the past that may coincidentally land on your device and compromise it. And so, yes, there is certainly, I think, a scale between based on the visibility of a given vulnerability. The more visible it is, and the more popular it is, the more likely is it that your device gets compromised in a non-targeted attack, in a coincidental attack. Like think WannaCry and the National Health Service in the UK. Like
Yeah.
nobody intended to attack the National Health Service. It was just because of poor patch practice for their Windows 7 systems and the non-existence of a patch for the Windows XP systems that the NHS was a perfect fit for the WannaCry virus and shut everything down. Not everything, but almost
Enough.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, enough to do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say anecdotally, right? We don't get calls from the FDA to the Med ISO saying, "Hey, we need to know who's impacted by some custom code sitting on a single device," right? They're asking for things that are more broadly out there. So the last one was what, Log4j, I think. I'm sure another one will come this Christmas, but it tends to be that those are the ones that get exploited first. I love the questions. Keep them coming. So key areas of focus that we want to make sure folks have a posture around, right? Making sure you can translate into business imperative, something that shows kind of the life cycle and how certain activities at certain times are not just better for device security posture, but also more cost effective for the operation of a device. Anyone who's brought a device to market knows every cent on the cost of goods sold matters. So ensuring that you're doing it efficiently will position security as more of a business partner and not a hindrance in the long term. Third-party risk, as discussed, major source of challenges that have to be managed, but certainly doable if you have the processes in place. And then the last one is having a strategy around legacy devices. And it's not to say, right, it's going to be perfect. I think it's just having a plan in place is gonna put you in a better posture overall. So as you think about it, right, when you have challenges for 2026, think about tools, personnel, as well as training for folks. The FDA, as part of their submission criteria, needs to see that the folks responsible for security have had training, and so that's an ongoing one that has to be demonstrated to ensure that your submission kind of works through the FDA. The next one, making sure you have the cross-functional folks. One of the common things we hear, right, is that the board says security is a priority, but nobody on the board is actually a security expert. So how do you ensure you get the right folks in the room at the right time to have that conversation and that there are representatives kind of all parts of the business to really talk about security matters to them? And then the last thing, right, we've seen folks have success with is picking a particular area of focus that is especially important, whether it came up during a customer diligence, whether it's something that the FDA came back in an AINN, and having a deep dive conversation around that tends to get people to buy into security being important a little bit more urgently because it's top of mind and something that's stopping progress. Just to put some resources out there, we have a white paper around life cycle approach, talks about financial risk quantification and how we think about security as a business imperative. Like I said, we'll share the slides afterwards as well as the recording, so you'll have access to all these links. And then we just wanted to put a quick plug in for the next session. We're going to focus on wearables coming up in October, which for those who have been hearing a lot of challenge from certain device makers on the market who don't want to be considered device makers and what they're going to do about it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, drop us a note. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all on the next webinar. Thanks again for your time and keep well.
Thanks for joining.